Hi everyone, Romance of Redemption Part 3. I once saw a man who on the tip of his finger had 30 mustard seeds. If faith as small as one mustard seed is all that's needed, what does this story tell us about faith? Let's have a look at the last few verses of chapter 1. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Don't call me Naomi. The name Naomi means pleasant, lovely, and delightful. Mara means bitter in taste or bitter in experience. We always have a choice with hardship to either allow bitterness to take root like a poison in our lives or to receive God's grace. We see that in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 15. We see this in the story of Hannah in the first two chapters of 1 Samuel, who did not turn her back on God in bitterness, but instead cried out to him for help. Verse 21, I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. That reminds me of the story of the widow in 2 Kings chapter 4. All she had left was a little bit of oil and empty vessels. Naomi had lost her husband, both of her sons, and one of her daughter-in-laws. She had lost all kinds of material possessions. All she had left was one daughter-in-law, Ruth. But through that one, God was going to bring unbelievable blessing into her life. They came to Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Barley is the first crop that is harvested each year. The harvest would begin in March or April and would continue through until May every year. So it would go for about 2 months. Now I want you to think a bit about Ruth and her situation. You really need to understand her situation to understand what's going on in this book for her. She was a widow. She appeared to be barren, given that she'd been married for 10 years with no children. Perhaps she couldn't have children. That would have made her an unattractive marriage prospect. She was a Moabite, and intermarrying with Moabites was condemned in Numbers 25. So no Jewish man in Bethlehem would be interested in pursuing marriage. And there would be very few foreign men living there. Because remember, as we discussed last time, where does this book take place, this story? Very early in the period when the judges ruled. Now, in that early period, they conquered the land, killing most of the former inhabitants. So therefore, at the time that this story takes place, there really hasn't been time for foreigners to come and settle in this part of Israel. So not only would Jewish men not be interested in pursuing marriage with her, there'd be very few non-Jewish men in that area as well. She was poor. She and Naomi had travelled from Moab to Bethlehem. This was a hazardous 7 to 10 day journey for two women on their own. during which they probably would have been discussing how are they going to survive in Bethlehem. As soon as they arrived, Ruth immediately went into the fields to collect the leftovers that harvesters had left behind. That doesn't suggest to me that she arrived with a lot of money. Quite the opposite. I want you to think too about Jewish marriage customs. These changed over time and were different from one Jewish community to another. So it's a little bit difficult for historians to know what exactly were the customs at the time where she first got married in Moab and where she got married again in Israel. However, what we do know is from the time of Moses, there were two separate events. There was the engagement and the marriage. The engagement took place before witnesses. We see an example of that in Ruth chapter 4. The two ceremonies took place up to 1 year apart. We see this engagement process in Genesis 24 between Isaac and Rebekah. For Ruth to have been married 10 years means she may have been engaged for up to 1 year before that. Girls were often married soon after reaching puberty. That was true for boys as well, although sometimes for boys it would be a little bit later than that. Assuming that Ruth got engaged immediately after puberty, around age 13 or 14, then that would mean that at the time that this story was taking place, she was about 24 or 25 years of age, about the same age as Joanne, Pastor Dan's wife. She was quite vulnerable to being raped or molested. She began work at dawn in fields with male harvesters. She was a foreigner, a widow, and poor. We see this vulnerability when Boaz tells her to stick close to his female servants in verse 8, and that he commanded his male servants not to touch her in verse 9. And clearly both Naomi and Ruth were aware of this danger because in verse 22, Naomi says, in someone else's field, you might be harmed. Ruth had a very limited experience of God. Her husband, whom she'd been married to for 10 years, had disobeyed God by marrying her. And the whole of the 10 years that they were married, she continued to worship the Moabite idols. She had a mother-in-law who was bitter toward God. Remember, in chapter 1 and verse 14, we're told that the other daughter-in-law, Orpah, went back not only to her home, but to her gods, her idols. And what does Naomi do? She tells Ruth to go and do the same. So her experience of the God of Israel was quite limited. And she was socially isolated. Other than Naomi, she had no one. She was a childless foreign widow. Even the lowest Israeli servant was above her in standing. On the journey into Israel, and whilst working in the fields, she would have experienced poor treatment from everyone. And yet, from the moment that he meets her, Boaz treats her with value and respect. I want you to think about the day when the romance begins. In the first 5 verses of the book, 10 years go past, just like that. In that first chapter, there's a famine that started and ends. A family migrates. There are 2 marriages and 3 men die. But in the first 22 verses of chapter 2, we have a single day. So in the previous chapter, a great span of time has gone past, but now in 22 verses, there's the focus on what happens in just a single day. For 3,400 years, people have been blessed by reading about what took place on this particular day when the relationship between Ruth and Boaz began. Let's have a look at the start of chapter 2. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain left behind anyone in whose eyes I find favour." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvested. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. In verse 1, we're told he's a relative. The word that's used here is not kinsman redeemer, but it's the word for a relative who is intimately known and is close. If Naomi had a close relative who was well off, why didn't she seek out his help when she returned to Bethlehem? Possibly the answer we saw before in Hebrews 12:15 and in Ruth chapter 1 verse 20. Naomi was bitter. She wanted to be called Mara. When there is bitterness in our lives, it poisons relationships. Also in verse 1, we're told that Boaz was a man of standing. Elimelech and Naomi had not trusted God to provide for them in the promised land. They had not believed the Deuteronomy 11 promise that if they were obedient, God would bless them. They had turned their backs on God and went the wrong way. But during the time of famine, Boaz and others had stayed behind and had trusted God. Naomi and her family made a choice in a hard time, a time of famine. But they didn't have to make the wrong choice that they did. The people of Bethlehem had not perished from hunger. They were still there, and they were blessed more than Naomi's family. Sometimes we justify wrong choices because of difficult circumstances. The expression, which is rendered as a man of standing in the New International Version, is seen elsewhere, such as in the book of Judges, chapter 11 and verse 1, where it's rendered as a mighty man of valour. It means that Boaz possessed the finest of qualities. He had remained faithful even in the tough times, and God had blessed him. In verse 2, she says, "Let me go." Here we see something of the character of Ruth in her initiative to take care of her mother-in-law. Naomi doesn't command Ruth to work. Ruth says, "Let me go." She has committed herself to Naomi with amazing devotion, and she takes the initiative to work and provide for Naomi. Also in verse 2, we see, "Pick up the leftover grain." What does she mean by that? Well, in Leviticus 19, we have the answer. "When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time, or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them," for whom? "The poor and the foreigner." Leviticus 19 commanded farmers in Israel that they should not completely harvest their fields. They were commanded to cut corners in harvesting and always leave something behind. Also, if they happened to drop a bundle of grain, they were commanded to leave it on the ground and not pick it up. This was one of the social assistance programs in Israel. Farmers were not to completely harvest their fields so that the poor and foreigners could come and glean the remains for themselves. It was a way of helping the poor. It commanded the farmers to have a generous heart. And it commanded the poor to be active and to work for their food. It gave the poor and foreigners a way to provide for their own needs with dignity. Notice in verses 2 to 3, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out. And then, as it turned out. Recall from Proverbs 16 and verse 9, "We make our plans, but the Lord determines our steps." Ruth had put her faith in God in chapter 1, verse 16. Naomi and Ruth had planned for Ruth to go into the fields, and God led her to a very particular field. To Ruth, it was no different from any other field, but God was protecting Ruth and blessing her and Naomi. Naomi doesn't know where Ruth goes, and Ruth doesn't know where she is. They've arrived in Bethlehem. Ruth goes out. Naomi has no idea which fields she's going into. And to Ruth, this is all totally new area. She's totally unfamiliar with it. So to her, she's just gone out into the field and just happened to go to the field of Boaz. That's how it seemed to her. But God, that's not how it came to pass. God was actually guiding her. We actually saw a glimpse of this in chapter 1, verse 22. The two women had decided to return to Bethlehem. So that was their planning. But God directed their steps, so they arrived just as the barley harvest was beginning. Let's have a look at the next few verses in chapter 2. "Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, 'The Lord be with you.' And they answered him, 'The Lord bless you.' Then Boaz said to his servant, who was in charge of the reapers, 'Whose young woman is this?' So the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered and said, 'It is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab.' And she said, 'Please, let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves.' So she came and has continued from morning until now, though she rested a little in the house." Notice in verse 4, we have what might appear to be just a pious greeting. "The Lord be with you." "Oh, the Lord be with you too." It seems like it could just be a pious greeting, but I don't believe that there's anything wasted in the Bible. It's there for a reason. I don't think this was just a pious greeting. I think this shows us something of the heart and character of Boaz. He had a good relationship with his workers. You can often tell the real character of a man in authority by seeing how he relates to his staff and by how they think of him. In verse 1, we saw that he was a man of standing, a man of valour. But here, more importantly, we see that he was a man of God. Why else would this greeting be recorded? That this wasn't a pious greeting, but a genuine attitude, is seen in the next verses, in the way he interacts with the lowest of the low, a poor, foreign widow. Now, I want you to take particular note of verses 5 and 6. I think these are really critical. Boaz and Ruth were introduced by an unnamed servant. The unnamed servant is symbolic of the Holy Spirit, whom we're told in John 16 will not speak of himself. And in John 15, we're told, who is the Holy Spirit? He is the helper, and he'll testify about Jesus. Remember, in Revelation chapter 5, our Redeemer is described in two ways, as the lion and as the lamb. He is our Redeemer in being the lamb who shed his blood in payment to redeem us. In Revelation 21 and verse 9, we're told that the Holy Spirit's role is to bring the bride and the groom together. That verse, Revelation 21:9, says, "Come, I will show you the bride, the Lamb's wife." Boaz and Ruth's meeting was not random, but arranged by the Holy Spirit. It was part of God's plan of redemption. In Genesis 24 is the beautiful picture of Abraham as God the Father, Isaac as the Son of the Father, and the unnamed servant as the Holy Spirit who brings the bride to the Son. Although we know Abraham's senior servant was Eliezer, meaning God is his help, from Genesis 15, in the story where he brings Rebekah and Isaac together, he is not named. And yet he plays a central role in their engagement. He is not a menial servant, but rather Abraham's right-hand man, the one who is in charge of all he owns and of all his affairs. He is loyal, devoted, skilled, and powerful. Abraham, whose name means father, charged his servant with the task of finding a wife for his son Isaac. When the servant arrived at the well of Haran, he prayed to God and asked that God would reveal the right woman. How? By way of a test of selflessness. And notice here in this story about Ruth, what impresses Boaz's unnamed servant about Ruth? It's her humble attitude, her selflessness. Let's have a look at verse 7. And she said, "Please let me glean and gather." We saw in verse 2, and here again, something of the heart and character of Ruth. The servant reported her humble attitude. She doesn't presume or demand her right to glean from Leviticus 19. Instead, she kindly asked for the right to gather in his field. Although she was a woman who we saw in verse 2 was one who takes initiative, she's not pushy, she's not presumptuous, but she's humble. Now I want you to think about Boaz. Need to think about his situation and, what is it about Boaz? We think of this story often purely in terms of Ruth, but actually Boaz is a very central character here, and we need to think about who he is and his background. Boaz was a half-breed, the son of a Jewish father and a foreign mother. I am a half-breed too. I am half German and half Indian, and when I came to Australia in the 60s, I was a German citizen. In primary school, I would often get beaten up with teachers looking on. They would break up other fights, but not these ones. They probably thought I was getting my just desserts. After all, to them, I was a Nazi. To Australians back in that era, all Germans were Nazis and the enemy. The fact that my mother was born at the beginning of the war, that her father was a policeman, not a soldier, and not a member of the political Nazi party, that made no difference. The facts didn't matter. I was German, I was the enemy. Similarly here, as Israel conquered the Promised Land and subjugated all of its inhabitants, killing most of them, there would have been little sympathy for the half-breed Boaz. Kids can be really cruel. Can you imagine the taunts that Boaz suffered? Not only was his mother a foreigner, she'd been a prostitute. We don't know why he wasn't married when he met Ruth. He was clearly older than her. It's possible that he had been married, or perhaps, although rich, being a half-breed, the local women were not interested in having children who would not be completely Jewish. In Ruth chapter 2 and verse 1, we're told he was a relative of Elimelech and Naomi. In chapter 1 verse 12, we're told that Naomi was too old to have more children. In chapter 2 verse 8, Boaz called Ruth daughter. In chapter 3 and verse 10, he commended her for not seeking after young men. All of this suggests that he was older than Ruth, but how much older, we don't know. He could have been aged anywhere from his mid-30s through to his late 40s. I'm friends with one of the cousins of my mother. Back in my mother's day, they had large families, as they would have had in the time of Israel back then. My mother is the daughter of the eldest son. Her cousin is the son of the youngest daughter. So even though they are from the same generation, her cousin is much closer to my age than he is to my mother's age. The same might have been the case here. So Boaz could have been a lot younger than Naomi, even though he was from the same generation, or he might have been older than her. And therefore, we really don't know. He could have been anywhere from his mid-30s to his late 40s. All we know for sure is that he was older than Ruth. Jericho's walls came down. Do you remember that story? Only his mother and those in her house were saved. Imagine her with little Boaz on her knee, telling him stories about Jericho and its destruction. Exciting for a young boy. Rahab would have had an understanding of the grace of God. She was saved because she rescued 2 spies in Jericho. Even though she was a prostitute, God chose to rescue her when the city was invaded. Boaz grew up in a household where the love and grace of God had been experienced firsthand. The stories of God's mercy on his foreigner mother would have been passed on to Boaz and may have influenced his feelings toward Ruth. If any man was going to be sympathetic to the needs of a foreign woman in that community, it would have been the son of a foreign woman. Think too about Rahab's profession. She had been a prostitute. In other words, a woman of disrepute. Ruth, in contrast, was a woman whose dedication to Naomi and whose good character were the talk of the town, as we see in chapter 3, verse 11. That might have had particular appeal to Boaz. I want to finish with having a look at the connection to Abraham. We saw it here in the unnamed servant, and it's developed further as we go through the book of Ruth. In Romans chapter 4 and verse 16, we have this: "Therefore it is of faith, that it might be according to grace, so that the promise might be sure to all the seed, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who are of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all." Thank you.